it can ignite, and all you gotta do is bring the light, 'cause a new light shines.
Shalom, shalom, my friends, and welcome back to another episode of the Light Lab podcast. My name is Eliana Light, and I'm really excited. I know I always say that, but I'm really excited to share today's interview with Rabbi Elie Kaunfer. I know Rav Elie from many years of studying on and off at the Siddur Institute. Siddur is an institute for Jewish learning based in New York City, but its influence has really spread all around the Jewish world. And Rav Elie, as he is often called, is the president and CEO and one of the co-founders of the Siddur Institute. He's previously been a journalist, a banker, a corporate fraud investigator, but we now know him as the liturgist extraordinaire of Siddur. He has a doctorate in liturgy from the Jewish Theological Seminary, and his work on the intertext of liturgy is something that we've quoted here on the podcast many times, so we think it's time to to talk to the man himself about his work. He has been named multiple times to Newsweek's lists of the top 50 rabbis. He has written books. He has been in a lot of impressive fellowships. And he's also a really engaging teacher, which is why you might hear me be a little flustered and not speak as well as I usually do, because I was a little flustered. I felt very honored that I got to speak to Rav Elie. His work has really helped me and my understanding of liturgy, and he's currently working on a book about applying his vision of intertext to the whole Amidah. So since we are in the midst of our Amidah series, felt like a perfect opportunity to speak with him. Take a listen and enjoy my conversation with Rav Elie Kaunfer.
Keep burning bright. Shine, 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 shine a new light. Shine, shine, shine. Keep burning bright.
Welcome, Elie. Thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm glad to be here.
When I started this podcast about tefillah, I knew that I wanted to get the chance to speak with you and learn from you. And I'm wondering if you could take it back a little further. What was your relationship like to tefillah when you were growing up?
Yeah, so tefillah was always a big part of my life. My dad is a rabbi and for many years was the rabbi at the synagogue that we went to growing up in Providence, Rhode Island. So every week we would go to shul and engage with the prayers. I think for me, that was an experience of familiarity and sort of comfort. I think there were moments of sort of transcendent spirituality in some of the ways that, you know, big synagogues can feel spiritual when there's a lot of people in them and people are focused, like on Yom Kippur, let's say. But for a lot of my childhood, prayer was just something that you did and was around. And I think it was only later in life that it got more intense and more meaningful for me.
Yeah, as an RK myself, a rabbi's kid, I totally understand. And I'm wondering, what were some of those experiences or teachers as you grew up that changed or modified your understanding of what tefillah is?
I think for me, I had sort of two opposite ends of experiences. When I went to college, my main relationship with tefillah was, let's get this done quickly and efficiently. And sort of my spiritual goal was to be at least as fast as the other services so that I could get up to eat their Kiddush food and not have other people eat it. So that was sort of the let's get through the prayers as fast as we can side of my journey. And then when I went to Israel after I graduated, that was really the other end of the extreme. I saw people who were spending hours and hours in tefillah and really using the words that I was familiar with in different ways that were much more intense and much more meaningful. And even though it wasn't entirely my cup of tea, I sort of saw what was possible when you took those words seriously. And that really opened up other pathways for me.
Yeah, I'm wondering if through your upbringing if you had a sense of what you were saying, like if the meanings of the liturgy meant something, or if it was really just that comfort in that repetition.
Yeah, I think when I was growing up, it was a lot of connecting to the words through the sound and through the body movements and through the melodies. And I can't say that I was spending a lot of time thinking about the words. I mean, not no times. In other words, when I was one of these weird kids who, although I went to public high school, I would daven in the morning before I went to school. So I was encountering the words of tefillah every day at that point, and I was thinking about what I was asking for, what I was saying, but I wouldn't say that I was going deeply into the words at that point. And it was more, as you say, the affective, non-cognitive connection to the words, which I think is very important and a deep part of my practice today, but really not connected to the meaning or the deeper references embedded in the words.
Yeah. I was going to say before you made that clarification, like, not that there's anything wrong with that, of course, because you had a base familiarity with the liturgy. I'm assuming that it allowed you to dive deeper into it kind of as an academic later in life because you had that foundation.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, if you are coming to prayer having the words in your head and then you're like, oh, that's what that could mean, or that's what that sentence, could take me to, I think that is an inherently meaningful journey away from Heschel uses these terms of familiar and intimate. He says we're familiar with all the words, but we're intimate with none of the words. And I think starting from a place of familiarity allows you to get to that place of intimacy easier. That's not to say that if you're not familiar with the words can't be made meaningful, but I think there is a particular journey for those of us who are familiar first and then go deeper with the meaning.
So how did tefillah and liturgy kind of become your academic subject, become the subject of your research? Because there are people out there doing really great things with Torah and Talmud, but I know, maybe there are more that I don't know and I want to know them, but I don't think there are enough people looking at liturgy this way. So how did you come to that?
Well, as an academic discipline, liturgy is actually a very small field in Jewish academic circles. As a wider group in the Christian world. But when I did my doctorate at JTS, I was the only person in the program at the time. And if you look at the field today, although, as you say, there's a lot of scholars coming out in the field of Bible, obviously, and Talmud and Midrash, they're very hot topics. Liturgy still is a relatively small discipline. And yet it's that thing that so many Jews encounter. And if you go to a bar mitzvah or go to Yom Kippur or even the Haggadah and Pesach, most Jews are encountering liturgy in some ways on a regular basis. And so I was always drawn to it from the perspective of this is a very news you can use field because it's just always in your life. And I was drawn to it academically because I was sort of open to the possibility that understanding the words takes deep training, and you can get to a certain place just on the surface reading, and that's great. But for my own curiosity and sort of intellectual journey, I wanted to go deeper with these words that were so familiar to me as we've spoken about. And so that's why I ended up pursuing at first a master's and then a doctorate in liturgy.
Yeah, I'll say for me, I feel a lot in this background. I grew up singing all the words, knew them. And then as a freshman at Brandeis, I took a liturgy class with Reuven Kimmelman. And that really changed my life, being able to say, oh my gosh, like people wrote these, right? Prayers were written by people is a line that I use with my students a lot. And there's poetic structure and there's biblical sources and all that stuff. It blew my mind. So I'm wondering if there were teachers kind of along your way, or I don't know, articles, experiences, academic schools of thought that you're like, this is it. This is amazing.
Yeah. So for me, I would say it was a combination of having teachers in person, but really encountering schools of thought that opened me up to different ways of accessing the liturgy. You mentioned Reuven Kimmelman. I really value the research that he has brought, and there's so many ways in which he has elucidated the connections between the liturgy on the page of the prayer book and what he and others call the intertext, the text that stands behind the prayer book. And I owe a lot to his method for my own pathway. I think that other scholars that influenced me, one is a professor at Ben Gurion University named Uri Ehrlich, who wrote a wonderful book called Kol Atzmotai Tomarna in Hebrew, and in English it was translated with the more accessible title of The Nonverbal Language of Prayer. And what he does is he goes through all of the body movements that are associated with the Amida, how you bow, how you hold your hands, where you look with your eyes, what you wear, how do you wash your hands or feet, and all of those aspects of the non-cognitive side of engaging with a core prayer from our tradition was really impactful for me. In other words, giving a sort of more academic approach to some of the intuitive feelings that I was able to experience by, all those body movements around prayer. So that was one that was really very impactful for me. And Ehrlich himself has shifted his focus and done a lot of work with the Geniza fragments, the Siddur parts of our history that were discovered in this great treasure trove of Hebrew manuscripts, and has really cataloged all the variety of texts that they have in the Geniza around the Amida. So I reference his work all the time, and that was really important for me. And the last person I'll put out there is a professor at Hebrew Union College named Larry Hoffman, who's done so much in his career as a rabbi and an academic to really popularize the deeper understanding of liturgy. He edited a great series called My People's Prayer Book, which you're holding up. And he also did a similar series on a number of prayers in the High Holiday Liturgy. For me, the book that I encountered, I remember reading this book on the subway one summer as I was a student, called Beyond the Text. And this is also a way of looking at the words, not only as their sort of interpretive meaning along the lines of Kimmelman, but also how you might use the words of prayer to get to a non-cognitive, sort of different spiritual plane. And he has a chapter in that book about sort of the mystical aspects of the prayer book, and they were expressed in certain words that give you a sound that is different from their translated or even sort of relational meaning. But like when you say in the Kaddish, Yit Barach, Yishtabach, Yit Pa'ar, Yit Ramam, Yit Naseh, you can translate those words into English and they can make sense, but the sound of just reciting those words is its own value. And just thinking about that in a more scholarly way was very powerful for me.
Amazing. I'm definitely going to have to get all of those books now and read them.
I just wanted to raise up one other academic who I think is really doing wonderful work. Her name is Dahlia Mark, and she is based in Jerusalem, and she teaches at Hebrew Union College in their Jerusalem campus. She did her doctorate on Birchot HaShachar, on the liturgy that we say upon waking up. And she's just an incredible researcher and bringing in all of the relevant material, both on the sort of traditional rabbinic sources and on the, body movement, more non-cognitive side. And she's written a lot about contemporary liturgy, especially sort of the evolution and reform liturgy. And so if that's something that interests you, I really recommend her. A lot of her work is in Hebrew, but she does write a fair amount in English as well. And she's been a wonderful.
Amazing. Not only will I read her stuff, of course, I'll have to find her email and bug her about being on the show.
I think she would be a great guest, actually.
That would be fabulous. I'm thinking now, kind of moving a little bit forward in time to the founding of Hadar, the Hadar Institute, as it is called these days. What was the place of tefillah in the founding of Hadar, and were you involved in that, and kind of how did that change or conform to your ideas of tefillah at the time?
So in the story of Hadar, I would start with our minyan that we began back in 2001. So this is going back more than 20 years. And part of the vision of the minyan was to have a Shabbat morning experience of davening that was traditional liturgy and egalitarian and had some sort of life or vibrancy to it that, we defined through music and other ways in which we were sort of all packed in together in these sort of New York Upper West Side spaces. That was an amazing experience because you got to basically from scratch decide how you wanted a minyan to go. Not only what words you would say, but sort of what's the spiritual character of that minyan. And I would say, for me personally, that made a huge impact in what was possible in tefillah, in prayer. And when we started the institute, the learning arm that we built out over the years, part of the experience of learning was always meant to be tied up with praying, with davening. And so, when you start a yeshiva, it's not just you sit down and you learn the Talmud, although that's a big part of it, or other rabbinic texts, but also you get to, in the same place where you learn, stop and daven. And that was always a very powerful experience for me, to be in the room where we just finished saying the morning prayers, and then we start our study regimen, and then take a break in the afternoon for the afternoon service. All that in one space is really powerful. So when we started the Institute, it was this opportunity, again, to imagine what could prayer look like. And in this case, on a daily basis, that was also intimately tied to the experience of being a student and learning as part of your daily activity.
So I'm thinking back again to when I was at Brandeis. I think you came as a scholar and you did a session with us on Ha'el Hagadol Hagibor V'Hanora and the intertext behind there. And you are writing, it sounds like you're almost done with this book on the Amidah. So I want to ask you about this project. I'd love for you to tell us about this project. How did it start?
So I've always wanted to write down some of the conclusions that I've been working on as a teacher over the last 20 years. And when I was with you at Brandeis, we got to look at this line, which I feel encapsulates the method that I'm so interested in so succinctly. It's this line that we say all the time, every time we get together to pray. In the first blessing of the Amidah, we say, Ha'el Hagadol Hagibor V'Hanora, the great, mighty, and awesome God. I think for a lot of people, the question is, why am I telling God how great God is? And, what's the point of saying that line? And when we look at the intertext, the place in the Bible in which this line is lifted from, you get a whole other understanding of it. It's, at least in the Torah, it's taken from the line in Devarim, in Deuteronomy, where Moshe is describing God and saying that God is the great, mighty, and awesome God, but then goes on to say, who loves the widow and the orphan, and who takes care of the stranger, and then tells us, you too should love the stranger. So there's an amazing flip that goes on in that particular line, in which we start off thinking, well, why am I describing God? Why am I using adjectives to talk about God? But when you put it in its context in the Bible, you say, oh, this is where God gets to introduce God's self and say, you think great, mighty, and awesome is, create the world, split the sea, but I'm telling you, it's love and take care of the vulnerable members of society. And that's something that is so powerful to just use as an interpretive, wedge to unmoor us from our, like the understandings that we think we have about the text. So that's just one line in one blessing. I really wanted to go through in a comprehensive manner the whole Amidah, the whole weekday Amidah, which has 19 blessings. So the book is a little more than 19 chapters, but each chapter essentially goes through a blessing and looks at the references that are embedded that I want to unpack for people. And although I have a lot of teaching that I've done orally, and you can find that on our website at hadar.org, I really wanted it to be something that I could sit down and write and people could read at their leisure. And so that's what this project is.
I'm so excited for this. By the way, the students that I work with, particularly the middle schoolers, that's really their focus is, wow, God must either have a very big ego or a very fragile ego for us to continuously tell God how great God is. It's a totally different angle. Are there any other pieces of intertext or midrashim or interesting things that you found along the journey that you were surprised by or you got excited about?
Well, I should start off by saying that the entire Siddur, basically every phrase in the Siddur has an intertext. And that itself is amazing to consider because it makes you understand what this text is. It's not just, as you said, people did write the prayers, but there were people who were reformulating divine words into prayers, as opposed to, I'm just coming up with these words out of my own brain. And I think that to understand the Siddur as sort of the next step of a holy text, the way we think of the Bible, of the Torah, is, here's a text that has a lot to teach me and that's complicated, and I need to open up commentary and midrash to understand it better. And I feel the same way, having done this project. I feel the same way about the Siddur. It's as if the Siddur itself is a form of biblical text that also needs to be opened up and analyzed in the same way that you would analyze Torah. And it's not that every line became more meaningful for me once I did that process, but a lot of the lines did. And I would say overall, my appreciation for what the Siddur is increased greatly because I was sort of like, this is an amazing work of re-scrambled and reformulated divine words. And that itself just is a great stance to have towards this prayer book that, everybody has their own opinions about, and I like this line, I don't like that line, but to sort of understand what the project of the prayer book is on a grand scale was really powerful for me. And certainly along the way, there were moments where I was inspired by some of the connections that are there.
And we'll have to buy the book and read them to find them, but I'm excited to do so. I want to ask you more about something you mentioned, which is about how it influenced you. Did this change your davening? Did it just change your praying? How do you take it from an intellectual exercise of text study into something a little different?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one that I think about a lot. How much does the study of the Siddur influence the praying of the Siddur? Heschel, again, also said that studying the Siddur is not the same as praying it. And indeed, for all the reasons we spoke about of the non-verbal aspects of prayer, it is a separate enterprise to daven than to study the words. I think for me, the way that it's impacted my own prayer life is when I want to go deeper on a particular line, if there's a time when, right now I'm working on the last blessing, Sim Shalom. So what does shalom mean? Oftentimes you can think of shalom as like political peace. But when you look through the midrashim that are, trying to understand what this word is, that's one of many meanings of the word shalom, even according to the rabbis. So shalom can also refer to the way in which we study texts as students, reducing machloket, reducing disagreement, which isn't about a political, this country versus that country having a peace agreement, but it's about how you move through the world as a student and how you interact with other students. And so, when I'm saying Sim Shalom, if I'm thinking about some of those issues in my life, it allows me to connect to the words on a much deeper level that's available to me. Now, that doesn't mean that every line that I'm saying, I'm going through the chapters that I've written about it every time I recite it. I mean, that would be a very, very long prayer, and it's hard to hold in your head all at once. But I think for me, there's two basic outcomes of this process in terms of my own prayer life. One is just understanding the Siddur as a whole, as something that is really magnificent and sort of an artwork to be admired. I feel like I have a lot more humility when it comes to just reciting the words and feeling the privilege of being able to recite these words that carry so much meaning, even if I'm not accessing the meaning points at every moment. And then the other is, in moments when I want to go deeper on a particular line or concept, I can. And that's something that is exciting to be able to do during prayer. In some ways, I think about it like how we experience Torah reading. As I'm sure from working with students, learning how to chant the Torah. When you chant the Torah reading in synagogue, you can listen to the sounds of the words, and that itself can be meaningful and beautiful. But if you're trying to get to the deeper understanding of each of the verses, you're like, this is going way too fast. Like, slow down. I need to pause and ask questions and open up books and whatever. It's like by the time you even do that on one verse, they're 50 verses ahead of where you were. So you could say, well, why are we reading Torah like that in synagogue? Shouldn't we be stopping and opening it up and spending the time? And you could ask the same question about praying. Everybody, says we're moving really fast. This is a very fast service. How could I stop and consider each word or each line? And I think there is a time and a place to do that, but it might not be during the prayer service itself, or to the extent that it is, it might be on a word or a phrase as opposed to every word or every phrase.
I was going to ask you about timing. That comes up a lot as a challenge. I'm wondering for you then what the value is in maintaining a traditional davening where all of the words are said, or at least it is assumed or presumed that all of the words are going to be said. Where does the value lie in that for you?
Yeah, I would say as a kid, when I would go to the daily minyan at my parents' shul, I remember thinking, there's no way they can be saying these words as fast as they claim to be saying them. And then I would practice, because I would been learning Ashrei, like Psalm 145 in school. So I was like, here's something I can say as fast as them. And I would wait till they got there, and then I would start at the same time, and they would be, it's an alphabetical crossing. They would be down at 15th, 16th, 17th letter, and I'd be at the fourth letter. But over time, I actually learned how to say it as fast as they did. And you can say all the words that fast. It's something you can train to do. Now, what do you achieve or accomplish by saying the words that fast is a question. I think there are some texts, interestingly, in our tradition that say the faster you daven, the better it is for your concentration. In other words, the slower you go, you might sort of break off into spacing out about this or that. And if you're really focused on the pace being quick, then you don't really have time to space out. And there is something to that, I have found. It's almost like going into a meditative trance where if you are keeping a pace, you can get somewhere spiritually that if you slow down, you might sort of go off path or space out. And so I think there is value to saying the words fast. That is not the same as studying the words, though. You can't study the words and say them very fast. That's just not really possible. But I think that there is an inherent value in reciting all the words of the tradition and reciting them at a pace that gets you done and you can continue to move on with your day. And that can also be a spiritual experience.
I saw that you posted, and this must have been earlier in your project, you posted on Facebook, what are you doing when you say the Amidah? What do you think is happening? Who are you talking to? What are your goals? What do you expect is going to change? I'm wondering, because I think about those questions, and I think students do, and everybody does. What are the things that you learned or discovered about that from the answers that you found and kind of for yourself through this research? What are we doing?
It was a great Rorschach test into what people are thinking about when they daven. I was posting on Facebook when I was working on a particular blessing of the Amidah. I would just start off by saying, what are you praying for when you recite X blessing, and seeing what people responded. What I discovered actually was that, to my surprise, a lot of people take the words of the prayer book very literally. So, you grace Adam or people with knowledge, with dot. So there was a lot of response on that of, I want to know certain things and I want God to help me know it, which certainly is an aspect of what that bracha is talking about, but that's the most literal way you can read the words. And I saw that over and over again, where people were, in terms of fighting for justice. Oh, I think about this particular campaign that I am working on in my justice work. Okay, now that's a very real and localized version of what it means for God to be Melech Ohev Tzedakah U'Mishpat, the God who loves justice and righteousness. But in terms of sort of a more abstract or big picture thinking, I didn't see that emerge on the Facebook thread so much. And that's fine. It was just sort of like, I'm interested to hear what people are thinking about when they daven. And it was just, they're thinking about very practical and personal experiences with each of these themes. So what I'm interested in, like the phrase tzedakah mishpat, the God who loves tzedakah mishpat, righteousness and justice. So in rabbinic literature, tzedakah mishpat as a mashup, as two terms that you could have just picked one or the other, like what's the difference in righteousness and justice, can sometimes be understood as compromise. That is to say, in the language of the rabbis, either bitzua or pshara, where you're not actually achieving the full truth, because truth means no compromise, but you're trying something else. And what does it mean for the God, to praise God as the God who loves compromise, which is a controversial term, even in rabbinic literature. It's not clear that compromise is the best place to be. Maybe truth should be the best place to be. And after all, isn't God's seal the seal of truth? So what does it mean? You're sort of taking an interesting stance by calling God the God who loves compromise, when you could have had a blessing about truth and call God the God who loves truth. So that's not to say that it's not talking about justice and righteousness and you can't think about the justice campaign you're working on. I'm just saying there's more there that you could play around with, and that's sort of what I'm interested in opening up for people.
Yeah. I'm wondering then, for you, what might a spiritual goal be in tefillah with the practice of davening? What is the aim spiritually?
So Rabbi Eben Leder has a great set of teachings around what are your goals in davening, and I connect to that idea that it's good to set out goals in davening. Otherwise, you don't know if it's being achieved. I think for me, the spiritual goal has always been one of yearning for connection. So it's less about achieving certain outcomes of, I want this and I hope it comes, like I want world peace, I want health or whatever. And that's not to say that I don't have moments in prayer where I am focused on those more bakashot, on the requests as, literal things that I'm hoping for. But I would say the general enterprise for me of tefillah is one of just feeling God's presence more closely. And I think that's can be achieved through the words, and it can be achieved through some of the other aspects that we've spoken about, including music and pace and the space and what you're wearing. And all those things come together to try to create a sort of spiritual journey in which you feel God's presence more closely. One of the interesting things about the structure of the Amida, where this comes out, is that when you say the Amida, you bow at the beginning. The first two bowings are in the first blessing. And then interestingly, you don't bow in Sim Shalom, the last blessing, but rather the bowing that you take at the end of the Amida is in the second to last blessing in Modim, where you bow at the beginning and end of that bracha. And anybody sort of looking at this from the outside would say, oh, hold on. You bow at the beginning and you bow at the almost ending? That doesn't make a lot of sense. What if Modim was the end? You bow at the beginning, you bow at the ending, which is Modim, where you're thanking God, acknowledging God. And what comes after Modim? So it's true that Sim Shalom is the next blessing, but really the structural element that comes between Modim and Sim Shalom is Birkat Kohanim, is the priestly blessing, which ends, V'yasem lecha shalom, may God grant you peace, which then leads into Sim Shalom as just sort of a riff on the end of that priestly blessing. But in some ways, when you look back at the priestly blessing in the Torah, you understand that this is God's answer to our prayers. So in other words, if the first part of the Amida is me asking God, me connecting, trying to reach out to God, this is God reaching back out to me. And at least the Midrash understands that this priestly blessing was recited by Aaron at the dedication of the Mishkan. And right after Aaron recites the priestly blessing, then V'yerak v'od Adonai, and then God's presence was appearing to the people. In other words, it's a precursor to having a spiritual sense of God's presence with you. So I've started thinking about the Amida as sort of a journey of getting closer to experiencing God's presence, where the culmination of the Amida at the end is sort of a liturgical marker of, yes, God is blessing me. I'm feeling God's protection and God's blessing, and I'm going to feel God's presence and even see God in the way that the Torah explains it in a clearer way than I did before I prayed. So I would say that's my spiritual goal, is to have a deeper experience of God's presence as a result of praying.
That's beautiful. I'm certainly going to think of it differently now. And I'm wondering, either using the Amidah as inspiration or really anything else, if we're talking about God, what is a God name or a metaphor for God that describes how you're understanding God in these days? Because there's so many ways, different ways that we think about and understanding God. Is there a favorite name or metaphor for you?
Yeah, I appreciate it. I wrote a whole chapter on Baruch Atah Hashem. Blessed are you, God. What's interesting about that formula, which is the building block of our liturgy, is that the rabbis decided to use the name of God as a required aspect of what it means to pray. You could have imagined them using a nickname of God that's not as intense as the four-letter name Yud He Vav He, but they chose Yud He Vav He and didn't dance around that. And for me, that name of God, the most difficult to, we can't even pronounce it, the most difficult to connect to in some ways, is a meaningful name. And I'll tell you sort of how I think about it these days. When God introduces God's self to Moshe at the burning bush, God says famously, Eheyeh asher eheyeh. I am that I am is usually how it's translated, or I will be that I will be, which sounds like very mysterious and esoteric, like, what's your name? I am that I am. Oh, that's kind of hard to connect to. But what's interesting about the word Eheyeh, which is just the first person conjugation of Yud He Vav He. Yud He Vav He is the third person conjugation of how you were translating that, will be or am. And Eheyeh is when God is speaking, saying that about God's self. I am that I am. I will be that I will be. But what's interesting about the word Eheyeh is that, first of all, it's only in the Torah, it's only associated with God. So even though it's a simple verb, I will be, it's a divine word in some ways. And in each time that the word Eheyeh shows up in the Torah, it's always followed with the conjunction im. I will be with you, or I will be with your mouth. God says that to Moshe in that burning bush scene. I'll be with your mouth. Don't worry. You won't have to face Pharaoh without me. And so there's an aspect to God's name that is about God being with us. So it's not, I wouldn't translate it as I am that I am, but rather I am with you that I am with you. The rabbis sort of famously read, why is Eheyeh asher eheyeh? Why is it twice? I will be that I will be. And they note that God will be with us in this slavery in Egypt. And God will also be with us in all the future exiles that we experience. And so the rabbis also sort of emphasize the be with as opposed to the be alone. And so I think of God's name, Yud He Vav He, as the instantiation, the expression of God saying, I will be with you. And that's sort of what I'm yearning for in the first place, is for God to be with me, with us.
Amazing. I love this so much. We did a whole episode on Baruch Atah Yod He Vav He, and we probably could have talked for multiple hours. So I'd love to hear from you. What does the blessing formula do? Are we blessing God? There's got to be something else going on, right?
Yeah, so there's a lot of possible interpretations of what that phrase means. And a lot of medievals were certainly bothered by the suggestion that we could be actively blessing God, like a transitive verb. I am acting upon God and blessing God. Indeed, most of the way they solve that is by saying Baruch is just an adjective. I'm calling God blessed, just like I call God Rachum or Chanun. I call God merciful. or gracious. That doesn't mean that I am mercifuling God, but it means that I'm describing God as merciful, as Rachum. So Baruch and Rachum just are the same format. So you could simply be Baruch Atah Hashem, you are blessed. I'm describing you. What I think is interesting is, and that's a great solution for the medievals who are really bothered by the possibility that I could be doing anything to God in a transitive verb kind of way. But in the Talmud, we get an example in which actually a rabbi blesses God, where a certain Rabbi Yishmael goes up to heaven and sees God sitting on the throne, and God asks for a blessing. And Rabbi Yishmael offers God a blessing, which is essentially, don't let your anger overcome your mercy, which is an amazing blessing that God struggles with, apparently. And the end of that section of the Talmud says, this is to teach you that the blessing of someone who is lesser than you in stature shouldn't be taken lightly. Now, certainly, a human is lesser than God in stature, but God shouldn't take that blessing even from a human lightly, and even God is in need of some sort of blessing. So I guess you could understand Baruch Atah Hashem as, I want to bless you, like, may you be blessed, as in I'm trying to do something to you, God. And that's sort of a daring stance from the perspective of what could humans do to God, but from the Talmudic view, it seems in line with what we could be offering in this relationship. I think, again, prayer is about, in some ways, deepening our relationship. And if the relationship between us and God is only one way, God gives us things or God doesn't give us things, God's presence is here or God's presence isn't here, then it's a little bit, attenuated. When you have a relationship, both sides of the relationship need to lean in some ways. And so the possibility that I might be able to offer a blessing to God might deepen that sense of connection. I'm not saying that humans are on the same level as God. I'm not saying that a human blessing is equivalent to God's blessing, but the possibility that we could offer a blessing to God might strengthen our potential connection to God.
I'm thinking through some of the vocabulary we've been using almost interchangeably, and we think a lot about words on this show. And I'm wondering if you could think through for us what tefillah is versus what davening is versus what liturgy and prayer are. Are there overlaps? Are they different? Is there one word that you use more than the other? What does it all mean to you?
Yeah. Well, as you say, you're looking closely at words. So each of these words has its own history and set of associations, which may or may not be front of mind for anybody at a given time, but it's fun to investigate them. I think tefillah is, I appreciate that word perhaps the most of all the words. I think tefillah describes, for me, both the Amidah and prayer more generally. And indeed, in rabbinic literature, tefillah, lipalel, often means, if not always, to say the Amidah, to say that particular prayer. The interesting thing about the word tefillah or lipalel is that the very first time it shows up in the Torah, it's spoken about when Abraham is meant to pray on behalf of Avimelech, of this local king in Canaan, who had taken Sarah, his wife, because he was pretending and she was pretending that they were brother and sister. And as a result of Avimelech taking in Sarah, apparently the Torah tells us all the children who were meant to be born weren't being born. In other words, there was a general stop up of any birthing that was happening. And so Avram has to pray, lipalel, in order for people to start giving birth again. And what's striking about that use of the word lipalel is that, first of all, it is praying for someone else. It is praying, and they use this term explicitly in the Torah, for refuah, for healing. And it's praying specifically for the birthing process to reignite. And the Midrash plays on this idea and says that all the knots that were tied become untied. So you can take this literally and say, oh, Avram prayed and they started having little babies, and that's that's part of how you might read that passage. But with the midrashic sort of element in there, imagine if prayer is about asking for the untying of knots that are tied up, the birthing in a more metaphoric sense, the loosening, as it were. And I think that's all wrapped up in the word lihitpalel. Oftentimes people speak about it as lihitpalel as a reflexive word, and halal might mean to judge in certain biblical contexts. And so I judge myself. That's an interesting take as well, I think, although I'm not sure how much actual weight you could give to that meaning from was this the original intent of the word? But again, lihitpalel can have multiple meanings. So you can sometimes think about it as judging yourself. You can sometimes think about it as praying for the knots to be untied. You can think about it as praying for someone who's not really in your circle. Avimelech was not in Avram's circle, and yet he's praying for their well-being. And that's also a powerful aspect of prayer. So that's on tefillah. I think, some of the other terms that you mentioned, I feel like liturgy is for academics. Nobody says, I had a great experience with the liturgy this morning. So that's just the term that's how I think about it. Deborah Reed Blank, another teacher of mine, has a real interesting distinction between liturgy and prayer, and really noting how they are not meant to accomplish the same thing. And, in some ways, davening for me is the act of praying as opposed to the words of prayer. And so when I say time to daven, that's not the same as zman lihitpalel. For me, davening includes all those aspects of the non-cognitive side that we've been speaking about, how I'm using my voice, what melodies am I using, where am I going, who am I davening with, what was the visual experience of that time. For me, that's all wrapped up in the word davening. I'm not sure there's etymological proof for that, but I think there's experientially different than reciting words of prayer.
So as I said before, I teach kids about tefillah, or I work with teachers on tefillah. And as a person with kids, I'm wondering how you approach tefillah with your kids, or think about tefillah education for young folks in general.
I think tefillah education is holy work, and I really am so amazed at the people like yourself who are engaged in drawing in the next generation to experience prayer in a meaningful way. It's so important. I think, one of the things that I learned in the pandemic is davening in our family at home does not work. So I would say we can have highfalutin ideas of what it means to be an educator. My wife was also a Jewish educator, but when it came time, chips on the table, we're at home every Shabbat, and it's time for davening. We did not have a great experience. There were obviously a lot of things going on in March and April of 2020, but that was, I wouldn't say our experience of davening at home. I don't have any great learnings from that, except to say that it can be hard with kids and with adults as well. I think that for me, the biggest way that kids can learn what it means to daven is to experience different kinds of davening environments. And this can be hard because a lot of kids, myself included, when I grew up, the only synagogue I ever went to was the synagogue of my parents. I think once or twice I went, bar mitzvah in another synagogue and found the whole thing to be totally odd. And I just didn't have any experience of other davening outside of my own little narrow lane until I was almost an adult. I think to the extent that kids can experience the wide variety of what's out there, it's really helpful and important. And I mean, for me, a lot of that took place in Israel. I think Israel's an amazing place for kids to experience the variety in davening. Every corner has a different option in terms of what davening could look like. And I think one of the challenges that we face in this particular age is, are you willing to go to a davening space that doesn't reflect your values in order to experience something that's different from what you're used to? So will you go to a traditional space that's all male if you can get in, even though that's not what your values are? Are you willing to be in a place that says certain words that you're not used to just to get the experience? I'm in the camp of the more experiences, the better. And to the extent that kids can experience that, also great. I think the other thing that kids see through is they see through the the spiritual double talk of their teachers. So if the teachers have challenges with davening, it comes through to the kids. And I think that's fine. Like kids should understand that grown-ups also struggle with prayer. But I also wouldn't want it to be limited to the particular teacher that you have and whatever their struggles are. So if you can go to a place where, let's go to this shul, everybody's really into it and they're loving the davening. And maybe that's not where I am as the teacher, but I want you to experience it. I think that's something that can be offered as a gift to kids. And I think the last thing I'll say is that when kids are in a davening experience that is real as opposed to contrived, that's also an important experience for them. What I mean by real is we're going into a synagogue where people showed up there of their own free will in order to daven, and we are a guest in that space, as opposed to we're constructing a prayer space in school or in Hebrew school for you to learn something from. But nobody's really here for their own motivation or reason. That's why, going to shul, to synagogue is so powerful, because the people who are in shul are not there in order to teach the kids how to daven. It's just something that happens by the by. And to the extent that that can happen, the more that happens, the better, I think, for the kids. The more real davening experiences they have, the more they can take away.
I agree with you saying that tefillah education is important, which I appreciate. And I'm wondering, is that important just for their relationship with tefillah, or what do you hope for them, both as children or as they grow, that a relationship tefillah can do for them as people?
Well, I think in its best sense, tefillah can help shape personalities. Some of that ideally would be done through the words. You're not supposed to pray in the singular, you're supposed to pray only in the plural, to give a consciousness of this isn't only about me, it's about us. For me, growing up, that had a big impact on how I thought of myself in the world. But I think also, seeing other people of other generations in a prayerful space and in a prayerful moment can also teach kids how to be in the world. When I see a grown-up who is really into it and swaying or chuckling or, davening loudly or however they're expressing themselves, for a kid to see, yeah, I can have a spiritual life that doesn't have to be bottled up inside me. It can take expression on my body and through my lips, and that is a great learning of just how to be in the world, whether or not you apply that to prayer exclusively. So I think there is a lot of character development education that can come along with tefillah education.
Beautiful. And to wrap up our conversation, all of the research that you've done, these methodologies that you've taken together, do you have any suggestions for what that could mean, both for communities of prayer, minyanim, synagogues, davening communities, and for individual people as prayers? How might this change or shape or enhance our prayer lives?
So my first recommendation is just to allow yourself to study the words of the prayer book. Thank heavens, there's a lot more resources out there now that you can take advantage of, and some wonderful prayer book translations as well. The Koren Sachs translation is beautiful. At Hadar and other places, you can learn more about the prayer book, and I think that that's one way to become more connected to the words. And there's also so much amazing music. You are obviously making some yourself, and a number of your colleagues in the field, Joey Weisenberg, Deborah Sachs-Mintz, Bacha Levine. There's so much out there in terms of liturgical music that is creative and contemporary, and I think connecting to some of those, again, non-verbal aspects of the tefillah can also be a project that anyone can take on, as all you need is a Spotify account. So there's a lot less barriers to entry now in accessing the words in a more deep way. And I think, we're living in a great time of access to information and inspiration, and we just need to set aside the time to encounter it.
Amen. Amen. That's a beautiful place for us to end. Thank you so, so much for taking the time to talk to me today. Very excited for everyone to hear all the wonderful things and the wisdom that you've brought us.
Great to be here with you, and good luck with all of your work.
Thank you. And thank you so much for listening. You can learn more about Hadar at hadar.org. Thank you so much to Christy Dodge of Allobee for editing, to Yafa Englander for our show notes. The show notes are great. They've got everything that you need in there, so please take a look at those. Please follow us on Instagram at thelight.lab. Join in on the conversation, and we can't wait to be back with you soon.